Hello, everyone. This is Brian Kelly from Association Mavens, where you get direct access to some of the foremost thinkers and teachers in the association industry. My guest today is Maddie Grant. Maddie is the co-author of the book Humanize. She is also the lead editor for Social Fishing, one of the most visited and respected blogs written for association executives. And she's also the chief social media strategist at Social Fish, where I bet you could guess that Maddie helps associations with, that's right, social media challenges. So welcome to Association Mavens, Maddie.
Hi there, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Great. I'm so glad that we were able to connect. Several weeks back, I did interview your co-author, Jamie Notter. Him and I talked about some of the great concepts in the book that you guys put together. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking with you about more specifically some of the aspects related to social media. And I know that Jamie and I had talked about how as associations began working on implementing social media into their organizations, some of the hurdles that they faced kind of brought to light some of the deeper organizational issues, and that was kind of the impetus for the book. So maybe from your perspective, could you start off by talking a little bit about that process and how you guys came to write the book and how social media was kind of a impetus for this content?
Yes, absolutely. So, with our work with organizations, we go in and we talk to them about social media strategy. And as they started to implement social media, there are certain things that were more difficult than maybe they anticipated. So, for example, they're thinking, okay, we need to have more people on Twitter. But all of a sudden, that actually means giving potentially younger people the responsibility to represent the organization online. And maybe this is an organization that has only ever had two people who are allowed to do that, the executive director and the media spokesperson. So, how do you start to hand over some of that control to maybe younger people? Is that a social media policies issue, or is that actually a trust issue that you're not used to giving more people the power to represent you online? So that's one example. I've got many more. Let's give you a couple. Another example is we would come in and start with a big brainstorming session where we ask groups to have people from different departments who are interested in social media. And we ask for people who are at different levels, so some junior people, some middle managers, and some execs. And you would be surprised, but some of the groups we worked with had actually never had the occasion to have an interdepartmental meeting like that, except maybe around, the annual conference. But, all of a sudden, we're bringing people in a room together who really aren't used to working together. They've never had a reason to be this kind of almost random group, but the group is based on interest in social media, and that's a different way to set up a meeting, to set up a group of people. So is that a social media management issue, or is that an internal silo issue? Another example is if we have two departments who are basically fighting over who owns social media. So maybe it's PR who think that they need to control all the communications coming out of the association, including social media, but they're fighting with the IT department who thinks it should be under their bailiwick because it's related to the website and all the different tools online and all of that kind of stuff. So is that a social media implementation issue, or is it a lack of collaboration? So we have way more examples, but all of these things that we're seeing are related to social media kind of shining a light on these deeper organizational problems. And we actually, Jamie and I, did a presentation actually with Lindy too at ASAE way back in 2009, and it was called How Social Media Changes the Way We Work. So even back then, we were starting to realize that in order to do social media well, you actually need to change how you work together, how you manage your teams, how you communicate internally. how you share information, all of these things that would eventually become the book, basically.
Great. Well, I mean, I guess that makes sense, obviously, that as you were, consulting with these different individuals, that some of this stuff would come to light. So it's interesting to hear, that particular aspect of how this got started. But I do want to talk through some of the, in the book you guys talk about 4 human elements. Before we get there, though, I did want to ask, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen a transformation maybe in the last couple of years, or the last year even, since you guys, have come out with the book? Are there any, stories or examples that you can talk about where you've been able to work with an association on, starting here with social media, and how that's kind of had an impact on how they think about their organization from a management perspective and managing, this particular area of communication?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I don't actually have one specific example, because it's every group.
Yeah.
Every single group that starts using social media will eventually realize that it's bigger than just whoever brought us in. It's bigger than just the marketing department. And it, for any engagement with us, that starts from day one. This kind of brainstorming meeting that I mentioned, that is right at the very beginning, when every group kind of realizes that doing social media right is going to, at the very minimum, change how they communicate internally, because you have to have that content strategy that flows all of the information and content that the association traditionally has, now has to flow through the center and then back out to all the social media sites in lots of different ways. So even if you're only focusing on communications and content, you're still hitting these internal collaboration, hurdles that you need to work through. And that's just even starting with, who's going to be on the social media team, because, obviously everybody's worried about staff time and resources. So they're thinking about who are the best people to manage this team, where other people can be pulled in at the right times. So maybe, people from the meetings department will be pulled in when it's time to promote the conference through social media, but they don't necessarily need to be there for the whole entire thing. Or maybe, people from legal or people from HR will come in to help set up the policies, but they don't need to be there for every social media thing. So just from the get-go, you're having these conversations about how we can share more information throughout the organization in order to really do social media well.
Now, have you seen, maybe let's just talk about the executives within particular associations where, the light bulb is going on and they're seeing, wow, I guess we didn't quite realize that the way that we've been communicating with staff at the various levels, maybe is in a position where it has to evolve. I mean, have you seen resistance to that? Have you seen people kind of accepting it as this is the new paradigm that we've all found ourselves in?
Yeah, I think we're seeing not much resistance. I would say there may have been some resistance back in 2008 when we started. We did a lot of talking to executives and convincing them that it was okay to relinquish a little bit of control over the messaging, all of that classic social media conundrum stuff. But we really haven't seen a lot of that in the last 3 years. So there's definitely a general consensus and trend towards the idea that having more people on staff participating in social media and therefore representing the organization is a good thing. Obviously, some executives are still more interested in the control issue than others. But even for those, it's about having the right policies in place. A lot of times when we work with a group, one of the very first things we do is help write policies for them. But the policies allow their staff to do social media. So the policies aren't there to police or to stop activity. The policies are there to to release everybody into the wild, but in a strategic and guided way. So I think, yeah, I think it's definitely a huge trend that pretty much every organization is in some path, some step along that path now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me personally, the thing that's most fascinating about this topic is that, you've got, for example, Dan Pink, who's talked about mastery and autonomy and all of those things, and how, our culture is dramatically being impacted by technology and a lot of the social technologies. And, he's kind of got let's say, a broader focus on what that means. And then to have you guys come in and shine the light specifically on social media and obviously how that impacts organizations, it's pretty interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the four human elements, and
Sure.
I'd love to just kind of get your take on, we'll start off with open, where you guys talk about systems thinking and having things decentralized, ownership, the different individuals who are involved in certain things, they need to have ownership of those areas. What does that mean in terms of social media? How does that help us have, or at least take a step closer towards having a more open organization?
Yeah, so the four elements are actually in order in the book from easiest to hardest. So the easiest one, which is not necessarily easy, is open. And really, this is one of the things that social media basically forces you to do as an organization, no matter what. So the minute that you have more than one staff person managing, a Twitter account and a Facebook account and a LinkedIn group and whatever else they're on, you're starting to open those doors because of the way that content works through social media sites, and because of the way that you have to be responsive. It's the classic two-way conversation thing. So a two-way conversation is automatically going to be a little bit of opening the door into the inner workings of the association when you're allowing staff to respond to members or other stakeholders in a sort of personal way, where it's not just funneled through either one media spokesperson or through one, customer service call center or whatever the traditional things might be for how members talk to staff. So now you have more staff potentially talking to more members and more prospective members, or people who are not yet members. So that's being open right then and there from step one. But then, like all of the examples actually that I mentioned earlier, once you start to understand how content flows internally through different departments and out to social media sites, then you start being more open and more you get towards more systems thinking internally, which is where different people in different departments know what's going on with other people in other departments. That's basically it. And one of the things that we talk about as a way to get more systems thinking is distracting your silos. So we think that having silos is actually good and really important. I mean, you have to have people who are very experienced in very specific things, and all the marketing people talk marketing together and all the finance people talk finance together. That's important. But if you have ways of getting people together that pulls them out of their silos just long enough to learn about what everybody else is doing, then that's good for the organization. So everybody pulling together to get ready for your annual meeting is a perfect example, but also figuring out who might be involved in a social media team, even on a kind of project basis, is another way to do that.
Okay, so the next one you've got is trustworthy. That's having transparency, some of the collaboration activities that you talked about, and also, I think which is very key, is authenticity. So how is social media helping organizations with that particular aspect?
Yeah, so this part is hard, and I think a lot of organizations are still struggling at a very individual level with the trust and transparency issue. So on the one hand, organizationally, we're wondering how much we're allowed to share on social media sites. Maybe we have members asking for more information about decisions that are being made, and are we really allowed to talk about why we're doing things one way and not another? Um, and they have to eventually be case by case decisions, and that can still be controlled from the center or by the leadership in some way if you get specific questions like that. But you also have other layers of trust and transparency and authenticity based on each individual staff person who is using social media. So what is the line between personal and professional, basically? Every individual has to figure that out for themselves, because some people will just never be comfortable friending members, for example. And if they're not comfortable friending members, but they still want to be involved in social media activities, maybe they could be writing for the blog or doing some other things. There's so many different social media tools that you can find the right thing for the right person. Right. But somebody else managing a Facebook page, for example, and inviting people to an event on Facebook, you have to have those friend connections. So that person needs to not only be comfortable with friending members and realizing that members might be able to see some of their personal stuff, but they also need to be very savvy with their privacy settings. So yes, members can see some of their personal stuff. That doesn't mean they need to see all of their personal stuff. Right. So these are things that, as more and more people start to use social media professionally for work, they have to grapple with where that line is and how you can start to build relationships with stakeholders, with members, and be more fun and be more personal, because that's how social media works, without bearing all, without feeling uncomfortable, and also without feeling like you have to be there, professionally, if you're not comfortable with some of those personal boundaries. So it's a learning curve for every organization, I think.
Okay. So next we've got generative. And I'm assuming that we're getting progressively harder here, as you mentioned earlier.
Yes.
So with generative, some of the characteristics are being inclusive, also relationship building. What are some of the ways that social media is helping us as organizations with this particular characteristic?
Yeah, so generative is one that we do have to explain a little bit, because it's not a word that we use on a regular basis when we talk about organizations. But it just means evolving. That's the human trait, is that we're always learning and developing and evolving. And as organizations, the opposite of generative is stagnant. So we obviously don't want to be that. And even though this is one of, it's getting towards the hardest human element, it's also, from a technology perspective, potentially one of the easiest, because there are lots and lots and lots of examples of companies using collaborative technologies in order to involve customers or members in their product development, for example. So the classic example is My Starbucks Idea, which is a website where anybody can submit ideas related to Starbucks. So, and then, once an idea gets submitted, it's like a suggestion box, basically, online. Once an idea gets submitted, it goes through a chain of approvals, and then it either gets approved or rejected. But if it gets rejected, there's a way for Starbucks representatives to explain why the idea didn't pan out. It's all very collaborative, and they have made a bunch of products. The little swizzle stick that you stick in the top that closes off the little hole if you got your Starbucks coffee in the car. Yeah. That was an idea that came from a customer. So anyway, the point being that there are platforms, and any kind of community platform or tool that enables people to really participate in the inner workings of the organization. And that could just be committees, volunteer committees. But those are things that allow the organization to be collaborative. which is part of being generative. So it's the idea that you can have your stakeholders, your members, your customers involved in the new or developing programs and services that you have. So I think it's not a stretch. It's just we haven't necessarily done it very well in the past. The people who decide on what programs an association is going to have is traditionally the leadership, the board, and then whatever specific councils or committees have always been in charge of the different programs. So now the idea is, can you involve more members in those decisions, at least from a feedback perspective, if not from an implementation perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's just expanding, the boundaries of, allowing more people to be involved in not only the discussion, but also some of the ideas and some of the collaborative things that you mentioned.
And actually, if you think about it, all of these elements are very interrelated. So you can't be more collaborative without being more transparent about what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
You can't be more transparent or more collaborative without being more open, and allowing more people to hear what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think kind of in the old order of things, it was very much, as organizations, almost a one-way dialogue and communication channel. And now, obviously, there's that two-way. But what's the step beyond that? Beyond communicating is now we can start, we can get feedback, we can have dialogue. There's, a give and take, and, ideas do come out of that. So this is pretty interesting. All right, so we're down to the hardest one, courageous. How does social media help us be more courageous as an organization, in the areas such as learning and experimentation, and also you guys have mentioned personal development.
Yeah, so social media is really, really important for this, and basically being courageous is really all about the fear of failure and the fact that it's okay to be afraid of failure, but you need to learn from mistakes and just keep going and keep experimenting. And I think, again, the very nature of social media means that you have to experiment, because when you set up a brand new social media site, you can't set it up in private. You just can't. Social media is, by its very nature, is public. So everybody is experimenting with different kinds of content on their different accounts, or how to really use all these social media tools which change all the time. I mean, I've just been reading recently about MySpace, which of course has been dead for a while, but it might be revived in a really interesting way. So, and I think that's actually, I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I think it's actually really inspiring to think that this site that could have just been forgotten potentially could reinvent itself in a completely different way. And for associations or any organization or company, if you have a learning culture where you're experimenting all the time and you're learning from what you're doing, and where the experimenting is important, not just the successes, then you can envision yourself being able to be really agile and follow your members, where they lead you, and even getting ahead of your members in terms of new developments in the industry. All of these things that we say we do or we want. Well, you can actually do those things through really careful, listening to people through social media, and being able to quickly test certain ideas and then let them go if they're not working. And that's something that is hard to do from a kind of culture perspective, but social media shows you the way to do it, on the ground, basically, little by little. If you get used to just testing everything all the time, then we believe that that'll kind of trickle up to your culture.
Well, this is some fantastic insights, so thanks so much for sharing. Before we wrap up the interview, I do have one thing I have to ask you. So, we're at least a few years into social media being kind of at the forefront of mainstream culture. Where do you see it going? Like what's social media 2.0, or how do you see it evolving as maybe the next 5 or 10 years marches forward?
Interesting question. So, well, I think the part of the nature of social media is the way it's so experimental. So I think there's some of it that we just have no way of knowing what it's going to be like. I do have some ideas, though. I think a lot of it will become more and more invisible. So, especially from the kind of big data point of view, so all of our activity online and through GPS and through our phones, and all of this kind of stuff that we're doing in this whole digital layer over our lives will become less separate than what we call real life, and just more and more embedded and invisible in everything that we do. I think that's one part of it. I think another part of it too is that as these things become more invisible, maybe this is a hope that from organizationally, it'll free us up to do more kind of intellectual, meaningful work, as opposed to a lot of kind of rote, sort of automated, mechanistic work that a lot of us still do. I think there's a lot of wasted time and really in this kind of transition period, which we have to go through. But I feel like an evolved culture, an evolved digital culture, will be able to, and I guess this is what the point of the book is in the future, really, we'll be able to separate meaningful human activity from automated, mechanistic activity in a much better way than we do now.
Got it.
Answer your question.
No, that's great. Just wanted to, since I had you here, just kind of get your thoughts and ideas on that topic. So, well, Maddie, thanks so much for doing this interview, and thanks to everybody for watching. Be sure to sign up today in the upper right-hand corner of this website to be updated via email when new interviews are posted. Also, be sure to follow @BrianKellyNow on Twitter to stay on top of all things Association Mavens related. Lastly, please submit your recommendation for which Association Maven you'd like to see interviewed next. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you another great interview. Until next time, bye-bye.